Mac, WNST, Angelos Machado, Britton Showalter, Adam Jones, Chris Davis, all of that. They're 40 games below 500, headed toward Nowheresville as Manny Machado is headed toward Hollywood. Luke Jones is headed toward Owings Mills, which might as well be Hollywood around here for the next 6 weeks as Lamar Jackson and Joe Flacco and Terrell Suggs and John Harbaugh and the incoming Eric DaCosta and all of the incoming rookies take the backfields in Owings Mills, and we got ourselves a football season. And I'll even talk about Hayden Hurst a little bit, won't we, Luke?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we spend such a long time in the off season. I mean, you and I talk on a weekly basis, sometimes multiple times a week, as far as what this football team is going to look like. And we now finally get to the point where they're starting to really count down to the start of the season. We're going to have training camp practices. We'll have preseason games, an extra one this year. Yippee. But
well, I guess behind all of this is what is the significance of that, right? Like, is that a benefit or not? Certainly Harbaugh would have had these guys in pads on Valentine's Day if he could have, right? So I'm thinking this is going to be one of the more interesting. I mean, they have these inner squads with the Rams. There's a lot going on here above and beyond the knee and the fans and all that we can talk about there and what's going to happen in our country between now and the beginning of the football season, which is going to affect the football team because it did last year. I know that. But on the field, boy, we got plenty to talk about here. After Manny Machado goes and plays in the middle of the night in Chavez Ravine, right?
No question about it. And again, I think the main storyline is going to be Joe Flacco, Lamar Jackson. Whether you're someone that is pro Flacco, pro Jackson, want to see Lamar Jackson on the field as soon as possible, whether you're more realistic and know that he's not going to be on the field, at least as the traditional quarterback, at any point in the near future, that's going to be kind of the headline. But you just said it, and I wrote about this a couple weeks ago at WNST.net. The team has a longer training camp. You know, they report to training camp before anyone else in the league, you know, even just before the Bears, who they'll see in the Hall of Fame game in a couple weeks. But there's a lot of value to that, especially when you have a rookie quarterback that you're trying to develop, especially when you have a 12-man draft class, especially when you have other young players on this roster entering year 2, year 3 that they'd like to see pop. But with that, all that value, with that opportunity comes great responsibility to keep everyone healthy. And that's going to be a big challenge for John Harbaugh, that he, from a scheduling standpoint, needs to have the discipline to give these guys some time off and to not run these guys into the ground like Bear Bryant with the Junction Boys by the middle of August, and then you're getting to week 1, and you're in a situation like you were last year where you have so many guys on injured reserve. And that's not to say that last year's training camp was too rough. I want to make very clear about that. But you do run the risk of putting players in harm's way from a fatigue standpoint, and then more critically, when they are fatigued, that's when injuries are more likely to occur. And just, you know, the sheer probability of it. More plays, more practices out on the field, more probability of slipping, a misstep trying to cut up field, an offensive lineman falls into another offensive lineman's knee. There's all types of different things that can happen over the course of a football practice. And not to say you put players in bubbles, but it is something that is going to be on the, you know, more than just on the peripheral as far as how John Harbaugh takes care of this football team while taking advantage of that extra work, as you alluded to, not just the extra preseason game and extra week of training camp, but also joint practices with the Rams, who are one of the most talented teams in the NFL, so that should be a really nice litmus test in August.
Well, especially for the offensive line.
Oh, sure, no question about it. You know, like I said, I mean, L.A., I mean, that's, you know, they're, on paper, they look like one of the best teams in the NFL. And you'll have another set of joint practices against Indianapolis, which is more of a wild card, but just gives you another chance to compete against another team. So all types of opportunities for this team to get better over the next 6 weeks, 7 weeks, but they need to try to keep themselves as healthy as possible. You're going to have some injuries. That's just reality. We all know that. At some point in time over the next 4 to 5 weeks, some player that we're viewing right now as someone that's at least reasonably important to this team's future, you know, and its present, is going to get hurt, and there's probably going to be a couple guys like that. So that's where you hope injuries occur at spots where you have more depth, but you don't want to be in a position like you were last year where go back and think back to how many players were on IR entering week one, and then they lost Brent Urban a couple weeks after that, and they lost Marshall Yanda in week two, and before you know it, doesn't mean your season's over, but it really does stunt the potential ceiling that you have, and ultimately we saw this team fall short last year, and I don't care what anyone says, and I know a lot of people say, well, next man up, and injuries aren't an excuse. When you have that many injuries, it's not an excuse, it's reality. Next man up is a T-shirt slogan. It's not reality when you lose 15 type, 10 players that you're really counting on for a season. It's really difficult to overcome that, and ultimately the Ravens couldn't in the end.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke out on Twitter, and he will be sweating it out. And this is different for the Ravens fans, right? Like, we haven't talked about the season tickets, and I'll be talking about that with Marty Conway and other folks, about what all this represents for digital ticketing and all that. But there is a whole new thing they've done, and the Ravens have morphed out of this Westminster thing, much to the chagrin of many in the fan base. And they've done private training camp, and you have benefited from that, obviously, as a media member. It's been a little more quiet. They've sort of quietly brought people in and done small things, but the facility was never built for that. And now they're sort of opening the gates, and no, you're not going to be the only one out there tweeting and having fun this week and next week and beyond. Fans will be out there. People were involved in this. PSL owners, of which I'm one, was involved as well. And there's going to be a new look for training camp from the fans' perspective, from the inside and the outside over the next couple of weeks too, right?
And it's very much needed. We talked about this years ago when the Ravens ultimately decided that they were going to keep training camp in Owings Mills. They were no longer going to go to McDaniel College, which we know that. I mean, that was a football decision as much as anything else. I mean, it's not as though Steve Bisciotti made money going out to Westminster, but we said at that point in time that this isn't a decision that's going to hurt them now when they're at the peak of being a championship contender, which they were in 2011 and 2012. That was going to hurt them at some point in the future when they weren't winning as much. Now, they haven't been the Cleveland Browns. We understand that. But they haven't made the playoffs only once since Super Bowl 47. They've missed it 4 out of 5 years, 3 straight years. Now, this ability to accommodate up to 2,000 fans, and it probably won't be 2,000 fans because they kind of they give out the parking passes to fans with the assumption that there could be a full car, but in most cases probably not going to be. But they're going to be able to accommodate a sizable portion of their fan base wanting to come out to training camp for a number of days this summer. I think it's 15 dates in Owings Mills, and then of course they have the stadium practice this week, the first weekend. So it's important, and hopefully it goes off without a hitch from a logistics standpoint. They have completed their 2-year construction project to expand parking lots, and they bought more land, and obviously they expanded their facility for the football and business side of things. So they have this, what was already a jewel that's an even shinier, newer jewel now as far as the work they were able to put in the last 2 years, and it's going to be good to have fans out there. And again, it's something this organization needs. Not to say that they haven't been able to do these things, but I think they've lost some of that magic touch that they had for such a long time.
Well, we talk about that with the Orioles, like what it's going to take for people,
sure,
for a lot of people to fall in love and for them to be what I call a love mark. Loved, sure, and respected. And the respect part for the Ravens has affected the love part, and then there's the field part, and then there's the part where Ray Lewis is going in the Hall of Fame a couple weeks from now that may rekindle some of those feelings you used to have, right? But maybe you don't have anymore. And that's a problem for sports. You know, that's a problem for our country in a lot of ways. Certainly it's a problem when the national anthem is played for me and for how I feel about things, given politically where this thing has gone. So I think people's feelings change in a lot of different ways. But the Ravens are trying to stop the bleeding and get people back to purple flamingos on their lawn. And I think deep down they realize, look, we have nice people here. We're the same people we've always been. The tickets might cost a little bit more. The price of poker is what it is. But we realize that unless we win 11 games this year, you're not going to love us anyway. Because that's the barometer for the Ravens. The Ravens' barometer is, are you playing in January? If you're not, I don't want anything to do with you. And the Orioles' barometer is, are you breathing and wearing orange? And if you are, please don't leave us and go to Nashville in 2025. That's where this thing has gone. And I'm celebrating my 20th year on the radio this year, and I know what the Ravens represent. And I remember when they came in as the purple Barney Birds, and Art Modell's kicking the dogs, and and Brady Anderson's hitting 50 home runs, and Cal Ripken's playing baseball, and the warehouse is all new and all of that. So I've seen this whole metamorphosis, and I am going to get into this with you about Washington baseball and what I saw down there in that stadium and the 10 cranes in the sky and all that. But the Ravens are trying to rebuild this thing because they realize, unlike what the Orioles realize, is they've got a hole. People your age and younger have never bought Ravens tickets, aren't familiar with how much money that costs because mommy and daddy probably paid for them. And now, that next generation needs to fill in, and they need 15 to 35-year-old people who, by the very nature of their age and their place on the planet, think the Ravens are just, came off the earth with them. Where guys like me that sat here and groveled for a decade, trying to get a team back for a dozen years, actually. And, my father died when there was no football here. Don't really remember that and sort of appreciate, wow, we got an NFL team here. They're like, oh, it's just the Ravens. They haven't won. I'm staying home and watching the red zone or whatever that thing is. The Ravens need more participation, and they need people to fall back in love with Hayden Hurst or Lamar Jackson or Joe Flacco, or more than just the kicker. God bless the kicker and Royal Farms and all that represents for fried chicken and what we do around here. But the kicker can't be the number one selling jersey around here.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and that's with apologies to Justin Tucker, who very well could be a Hall of Famer by the time his career is over years from now. But yeah, I mean, and let's be very clear about this. There are ebbs and flows to this. I mean, even the New York Yankees dealt with an empty Yankee Stadium in the late '80s. So even the crown jewels of professional sports will have periods.
Well, remember, maybe you don't remember because you were a kid. The Redskins. Oh, you could never get a Redskin. They're going to build a bigger, better Redskin. There's 90,000 seats. And the Redskins for the last 20 years have been the furthest thing from that wait list that Jack Kent Cooke would always, we have 38,000 fans on our waiting list. I remember all that stuff from the 80s. Why Baltimore not going to get a team? We got 38,000 people on our waiting list down here. We're a powerhouse franchise. And now they're not anymore. I mean, the Cowboys, they're America's team, but you don't ever have a problem getting a ticket in Dallas. Same thing in Pittsburgh. You and I go to Pittsburgh every year. You can get in for $50, $75 outside anytime they play, anytime. Dirty little secret, right? But that's, such is life. They built these stadiums pretty big.
Sure. And, I've opined to you that my thought on the future of professional sports, maybe not even 30 or 40 years from now, is that stadiums are going to transform into glorified television studios because it's all TV. But going back to my point, you're going to have some lulls. You're going to have some downtimes. And the Ravens have had that relative to where they were in the first half of John Harbaugh and Joe Flacco's time here in Baltimore. And you do need to adapt. So that's why it's good to see them lower concession rates and offer more opportunities for fans to attend training camp who haven't been able to in the last 6-7 years since they've moved out of Westminster. Anything you can do to touch your fans, ultimately it's about winning. We know that. That's still going to be the driving force. And this past week, the Packers even put out with their shareholders that their profit margins were down 50%. Why? Because they didn't make the playoffs. So there's always going to be other issues at play, and certainly we've talked about that with the anthem, and that's been a league-wide thing, and that will continue to be a topic of discussion. But for most people, on an annual basis, the thing that's going to drive interest the most is how successful have you been, and the Ravens have just been okay since Super Bowl 47, and that's fine for a year or two after you win the championship, but if you're not getting back to the playoffs and playing January football on a more consistent basis. That doesn't mean winning the Super Bowl every year, because I do think this fan base has been spoiled for stretches of the last 2 decades, certainly. But you do need to adapt and do some things and change some things up and be more proactive. And I think we've seen the Ravens do that in certain ways, and we'll see how it plays out. But ultimately, there's going to be a lot more interest in this team if they're 7-3 through the first 11 weeks of the season than if they're 4-6 and needing to run the table to make the playoffs again. And I think certainly winning will go a long way in resparking some of that enthusiasm. But again, in the meantime, having training camp where you can accommodate 1,500 to 2,000 people on a daily basis, that's something that shouldn't be viewed as anything but a plus for this organization that needs some of that goodwill, needs to reconnect with its fans, regain that magic touch that they've had here for such a long time.
All right, look, man, I'm going to give you a chance to towel off. We're all figuring out the backside of the Machado thing and figuring out what the Orioles are doing as the Ravens roll the football out. The Flacco-Lamar Jackson thing will be a daily just on that, I'll leave it on that because that's where people are. The Flacco-Jackson thing, you're out there. What are you looking for in all of this? And what would you tell anyone who has a day pass that wants to go out there and watch these guys throw the football around about being out there on a 92-degree day? Because this is going to be a different kind of camp with him because of the level of scrutiny on the. We haven't looked at a backup quarterback out there other than Matt last year, running around because of circumstance, shall we say.
Flacco wasn't out there, right?
Yeah, but other than that, we haven't had any eyes on, how Matt Schaub looks or whatever, which was never very good, quite frankly. But this is going to be different. And I think we should be real careful about how we portray this because I will right now put $1 down that Lamar Jackson will not lead this franchise this year unless Flacco gets injured. I don't think you'll see him other than in some sort of chicanery or a play here, a hitch there, or a ball there, or whatever it's going to be. I don't expect Lamar Jackson to be starting Week 12 unless Flacco gets injured, which we can never account for. But I don't think Lamar Jackson's going to go out and outplay Joe Flacco and will himself onto the field. And I don't think Flacco's going to go out there and fall down a flight of steps and not be able to play football this year. That's my prediction on all of this.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think the one scenario, an injury always changes things. My goodness, it was 10 years ago at this time. We were talking, not you and I, because I wasn't at WNST at that point, but everyone was talking at that point that no way that this rookie Joe Flacco is going to be ready. People didn't want it to be Bowler, but Bowler was still on the roster, and Troy Smith was the guy that I think a lot of people assumed would kind of be the guy, at least in 2008 to begin the year, maybe Flacco halfway through the year, and we saw what happened. So you never know, but I tend to agree with you. I think the one scenario that's not injury-related would be if the Ravens have injuries, they play poorly, the offense plays poorly, it looks like Marty Morningwig's going to be out the door, who knows who else, and let's say they're 4-7 going into the month of December and Joe Flacco's playing poorly. I think you can make an argument then that perhaps the Ravens give Lamar Jackson his shot, and it might even be this coaching staff's last-ditch effort to save their jobs. Who knows?
Well, yeah, 3-7, I would fully agree. I just don't think they're going to be 3-7. I don't think there's any track record for that. I don't think they've ever.
They went 5-11 3 years ago, so I think there's a track record for it. But that's the scenario to me. Because hey, let's face it, and I know you and I have thought about this, and we'll argue about it some more. This organization doesn't have the confidence in Joe Flacco that they once did, or they wouldn't have drafted Lamar Jackson. It's just that simple.
That's a fact. That's a fact.
So if they felt enough conviction to draft a quarterback in the first round, and I get it, they used their second-round pick. They kind of felt like, well, we used our second-round pick this year and next year to take a guy who might be our franchise guy in a year or two. That's fine, but that does speak volumes about how you feel about the guy right now. So if those concerns come to fruition and this team has a bad season and has some injuries in the wrong spots and it's not getting done and they're not making the playoffs, then it makes sense to look at Lamar Jackson at that point. But I'll say this, and I've done some radio hits in other markets, where people have asked me what I've thought about the Ravens, and me, I've been pretty about them the last few years. They've kind of been what I've expected them to be for the most part, in that 8-8, 9-7 kind of territory where they're not bad enough to get a great draft pick and not good enough to make the playoffs. But I'm cautiously a little more optimistic this year that I think they can get back to the playoffs. I think the continuity on defense helps a ton. I do think Joe Flacco is healthier, and I think he does have that fire lit under him that didn't necessarily need per se, but I think that helps anyone in any line of work, quite frankly. And even though I still have concerns about this offense on the offensive line and at the wide receiver and tight end positions, I think there is enough upside and there are enough options at those positions that their offense, by and large, should be better than it was last year. Not great, but I think they can be more in that average kind of territory, which if you couple that with a really good defense, which I think they have a chance of being really, really good, then you have a team that, to me, looks like they can win 9-10 games and make the playoffs, and maybe if things go really well, maybe 10 or 11. But I am a little more optimistic.
Let's start with beating Buffalo.
Yeah, well, and I'm a little more optimistic. I'm going to put a little more faith in both John Harbaugh and Joe Flacco kind of being under fire here.
Well, that's why when you said, they were 5-11 a couple years ago, and I'm thinking to myself, that was really the outlier of the whole thing for the decade. So I am going to give them the benefit of the doubt and think that they're going to be 4-3, 5-4, 7-5, and like that, right around Thanksgiving, and then we'll figure out December. I don't think they're going to start the season 2-5, and if they do, all hell will break loose as it should. But I don't crystal ball that. Any more than I crystal ball the Cleveland Browns winning 7 games this year. I just don't. I don't think they're in for a precipitous fall, and I think this has been a wake-up call to Flacco, and we'll see what he's got under the hood. I'm going to bet on him instead of against him. I'm going to be that guy, and we'll see how it turns out.
That's fair, and I think the one thing that we should acknowledge, the schedule does look tougher on paper, but you know how that works. I mean, games that you think are going to be the most impossible end up being really easy. And then games like, going to London to play the Jacksonville Jaguars, the lowly Jaguars, well, we saw how that turned out. So, yeah, on paper they're going to be facing some tougher quarterbacks. They've got some tough road games early in the season that they're going to have to navigate. But, hey, this is the NFL, and if you can't make your way through that, I think, maybe changes are in order at that point. But for me, I'll go back to the point that I kind of made a little bit earlier in the conversation. The team needs to find a way to stay healthier, and I don't think it's anything that they're being negligent with. They've revamped their conditioning program. They did that a couple years ago. They put natural grass back in M&T Bank Stadium. John Harbaugh regularly gives veteran players a day when they need it, and I think you're going to see more of that this summer with the elongated schedule and training camp. But they got to find a way to not have 12 guys on injured reserve by the time the season starts, because you're really stunting your ceiling at that point. And as much as I just said, I could see a scenario where if things go really well for them, they could win 10 or 11 games. Well, you lose that many players before the season even starts, you're back in that 8-9 win territory where things are going to have to really go well for you, and you're going to have to get lucky and hope that the rest of the AFC isn't that good. So they need to stay healthy, and it feels like the worm has to turn with that at some point, and just being able to keep guys on the field and have a chance to be a better football team. It's not exactly rocket science.
We're headed off to Canton, Ohio for the Ray Lewis induction. You can learn all about that under the Road Trips tab at WNST.net. If you see Luke out at Owings Mills, say hello. He's also Baltimore Luke out on Twitter and Luke at WNST.net. I am Nasty at WNST.net. We're on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live on our Facebook as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.